Now we have the next speaker, who is Kathryn Walker. I see her. Hi, Kathryn. I see her in the video. The title of her contribution is Evolution of Morphology Through Sculpting in a Voxel-Based Robot. So when you're ready, you can start, Kathryn.
Perfect. I'll just share my screen. Oh, just give me 1 second.
Yeah, of course.
For some reason, because I have 2 PowerPoint presentations up, it doesn't want to share the screen of the correct one. So,
okay. Oh, yes.
If you just give me a second.
We see it.
Yes, you see the correct one, Evolution of Morphology.
Yeah, yes, that's one. Okay, thank you very much. You can start.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. Not quite sure of the time zones. My name is Kathryn or Kat Walker, and as I was lovely introduced, the title of my talk is Evolution of Morphology Through Sculpting in a Voxel-Based Robot. And this was work that I carried out as part of my PhD. So it's with my PhD supervisor, Helmut Hauser, who is of University of Bristol, and I'm currently at IT University of Copenhagen. There's our contact details, including our Twitter handle, if you want to get in touch. So in this work, we're interested in not evolving a fixed robot morphology, but instead evolving an adaptation or sculpting mechanism that allows the robot to adapt its morphology in response to different environmental feedback after birth or initialization. And this is with the aim of creating more adaptive, robust robots. So first, I will start with explaining why this is something interesting or important that we should be investigating. And it's generally a well-known fact that traditionally designed robots aren't very robust. They're typically designed for a single environment, and if that environment is well-known and well-controlled, they'll work really well. And that's the case of robots, for example, in factory lines. However, if the robot's then required to operate in a different environment or perform a different task, usually it will fail. So at this point, the robot designer usually changes the controller to try and enable more adaptive behavior in the robot. However, you could get the situation where more and more adaptive behavior is required. So the controller becomes more and more complex, and eventually the robot still fails in its quest to be adaptive. So as everyone probably knows, this session is called Bio-Inspired Approaches for Modular Robots. So here comes the bio-inspired part. So in contrast to traditionally designed robots, or most robots at the moment, in fact, nature is really adaptive. It's great at adapting to many different environments and situations. And we can hypothesize that this is for many different reasons, but in our work, we're going to suggest 2 main ones. And the first one I kind of alluded to in the previous slide is that biological systems can change both their morphology and their control to adapt to new environments and situations. And just a quick note in case anyone's lost, when I say morphology, I'm referring to the robot's or biological system body shape, but also other physical properties such as maybe stiffness or density. And so for the second reason that we hypothesize, this is that these biological systems can actually change their morphology and their control on many different timescales. So we've got millions or thousands of years through evolution, a few years or months, depending on the species, and that's sort of growth or development, and also instantaneously through perhaps learning. And I think a really good way to explain this morphological adaptation via development further is in the context of plants. So they obviously adapt through evolution. You get cactuses that are in the desert, and you get Venus flytraps that have evolved for, I don't know, jungle environments with lots of bugs. But they're also adapting to their environment on this growth or development timescale. So if you have a light source that's to the right of the plant, as very well demonstrated by my basil plant that's growing here in sunny Copenhagen, it will grow towards the right. However, if you have the light source on the left, the plant will grow towards the left. So you might have the case where you have two genetically identical seeds, but yet two different plants with different morphologies will grow depending on the environment that they're in. So therefore, we're inspired to explore whether we could evolve adaptive systems that would allow voxel-based robots to develop or sculpt their bodies in response to environmental feedback. And we do this in the context of locomotion. So in our system, we always start with the same initial robot. And this is a voxel-based robot, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But for those who aren't, we have two types of cell or voxel in a voxel-based robot. We have active cells and passive cells. Active cells are able to expand and contract, and they do this in response to an external sinusoidal signal. And you can also add a phase shift to each of these voxels, so neighboring cells will expand and contract slightly out of phase to each other. And so we create what we term the control system of the robot. And so if you look at the little purple and cyan diagram on the bottom left, this is the initial robot, and you can see that it's got a core of active voxels with a phase shift going down the y-axis of the robot. And this is surrounded by passive voxels, which do not have the ability to expand and contract. Because we really wanted to test how much adaptation and increase in performance we could get from just changing the morphology, we're actually keeping these center control system active voxels completely the same. They do not have the ability to change any of their properties, and they will not be removed, as the title sculpting would suggest. It's the passive ones that we're changing the properties of and therefore removing. So our sculpting or adaptation approach is episodic. We take our existing robot, which you can see attempting to locomote in the center. It's not very good because it does not have optimal morphology for any environment. And we simulate it in different environments for an episode or 7 seconds. And during that episode, we're recording the kinetic energy of each of the passive voxels and also the distance that this current robot morphology travels. We then, for each passive cell, input the kinetic energy and that global distance into the same neural network. And the neural network we term the sculpting adaptation system. Then, for each voxel, it will output how much we should increase or decrease that voxel's stiffness. So if we decrease the voxel stiffness to below a certain value, that voxel is then removed, and that's the sculpting part. So once all our different voxels or cells are updated, we then re-put our new morphology back into the same environment, and we repeat the process for a number of episodes, 15 in fact. And then the fitness of the sculpting adaptation system is the distance traveled in the final episode, so episode 15 of the robot. And note that we're not evolving the final fixed morphology of the robot. Instead, we're evolving the sculpting adaptation system, in particular, the weights of the neural network. And you can see the neural network down there on the right. It might strike you that this neural network is very simple, and this is somewhat deliberate. As far as we know, we're the first people to try adapting robot morphology through sculpting. So we wanted to keep our adaptation system as simple as possible to test its potential, but maybe also its limitations. So we evolved these sculpting adaptation systems for performance in 3 different environments: locomotion along flat ground, locomotion uphill, and the hill is 15 degrees, and locomotion across the hill. So it's not to go up the hill, it's not to go down the hill, it's to move across it. And actually environment C yielded a slight tweak in our fitness function in that, and this is something I love about artificial evolution, but it is a challenge, is that actually, because it originally our function was distance in any direction, what we were finding was some preliminary robots were getting really good fitness because all they would do is turn and walk straight downhill. So obviously this isn't really the behavior we wanted, so we just adjusted our fitness function so it's in the direction of the y-axis of the robot, and we penalize it if it does attempt to go off course. And so, as I said, we evolve individually in these 3 environments. We do 10 different evolution runs with a population size of 30. We run for 100 generations. And so these are some initial results here with little videos of how these optimized robots, so these are the final morphologies produced by the optimal sculpting adaptation systems, perform in each of the environments. And so the really good news is that they really outperform the unoptimized cubed lump. So that's good news. If we look at the generational fitness chart in the bottom, we see that the optimal sculpting adaptation systems generate robots that perform best in A, B, and then C seems to be the hardest environment to locomate in. And so kind of showing you some of the example final morphologies generated from these optimal sculpting adaptation systems. But if we take a look on this slide, we can see them in a bit more detail. So an initial observation that you may have is that there's not that much diversity, especially, for example, in environment A. So these are the champions, I should say, from each of the 10 environmental runs the final morphology is produced. And you can see that they're all, well, pretty similar. This could be down to using quite simple genetic algorithm, or it could be down to the fact that our neural network isn't very complex. But another more interesting observation is that these morphologies are indeed adapted to their different environments. So for example, if we compare environment A and environment C. So environment A is just the flat ground. Environment C is where we're trying to go across the slope, which is quite an asymmetric environment. And you can see this asymmetry in the example of C1 here. If we compare it to A1, A1 has the 2 sort of front legs removed, whereas C1 only has one of the front legs removed. And this, if we go back to the video, allows it to twist one of its side, the side going downhill further, and this means that it will carry on in a straight line and overcome the effects of the slope. If we were then to put this morphology in environment A, because environment A isn't asymmetrical, this robot would just walk around in circles, and vice versa. If we then put A into environment C, it just ended up just going straight downhill, which is, of course, not the behavior that we want, and we would say this has failed. Now, you may be at this point forgiven for thinking, well, how is this different from just evolving the morphology, the final morphology directly? Okay, the robots have nicely adapted to their different environments, but what benefit is there to this developmental sculpting system? Because in fact, this time with our sculpting system, you actually have to test each morphology at each episode in the environment. And this is more time consuming of simulation time when it appears you're just getting the same result. Well, we had hoped that because the system uses the environmental feedback, that the evolved neural networks would be able to interpret this feedback differently and therefore develop different but well-adapted morphologies for different environments. So we wanted to see if this was actually the case. And these are what these graphs show here. So on the left-hand side, we took the champion sculpting adaptation systems that were evolved in environment A and used them to develop robots in not only environment A, but also environment B and environment C. So the performance in each of these environments is shown. The green bars with the black dots are how it performs in environment A. And obviously it's doing well because we've evolved for performance in environment A. But if we try and use these sculpting adaptation systems that were evolved in environment A to then sculpt robots in environment B or C, you can see that we're getting fitnesses of below 0. So we're terming this the robots failed. And in these cases, what's happening is the robot is just falling down the slope. However, if we then move to the middle hand graph, so this is showing the performance of the final morphologies that have developed in each of the environments using the optimal sculpting adaptation systems found in environment B. And remember, we're kind of thinking that this is a slightly more complex environment than the flat ground of environment A. And here you can see, not only are these optimal sculpting systems able to sculpt successful morphologies in environment B, the one they were evolved in, but in, I think, 8 out of 10 of the cases, they're actually able to sculpt successful morphologies in environment A, which they haven't seen during evolution. And actually, in one case, they can also sculpt a successful morphology in environment C, again, which hasn't been seen during evolution. And then if we look at environment C and the sculpting adaptation systems that are evolved in that environment, we're seeing a very similar trend. So they're able to sculpt successful morphologies in environment C and also in environment A, but not so much in environment B, apart from that one case. And again, this is highlighted by the red square. Now, a hypothesis that we take from this is actually if you evolve a sculpting adaptation system in an environment that is more complex than another environment, there's a good chance that you might be able to transfer it to this simpler environment. And like I say, if it is able to sculpt a successful morphology in an environment that has not been evolved in, we term this transferable. However, it seems to be more challenging to evolve a optimal sculpting adaptation system in one environment and then transfer it to one of equal complexity or even more complex. And that's why we're only seeing 2 cases where the adaptation systems are truly transferable between all the environments. So in an attempt to find more transferable systems other than just these 2, rather than just looking at the champions from each of the evolutionary runs in the 3 environments, we look at the entire populations of each of these runs in each of the environments. Because you might get the case that, okay, it doesn't, the final robot morphology that is sculpted isn't really, really good in, for example, environment A, but it possesses this sort of transferability. So we just want to see if we can find more of these transferable systems. And I'm pleased to say that we did. We found 7 of them. So the graph on the left-hand side shows these 7 transferable genomes and how far the final morphologies have been able to travel in each of the 3 environments. And the black dot is showing which of the environment the sculpting adaptation system was initially evolved for. So as you can see, there's not many cases where it was initially, well, there are no cases where it was initially evolved for this simple flat ground environment A, and it's mainly between the more complex environment B and environment C, which is where we're finding these transferable adaptation systems. So you can also see on the right-hand side some examples of how these robots are sculpting themselves. So we start off with our initial boring, unsuccessful, lumpy cube robots, and over the 15 episodes, you can see the stiffness increasing and decreasing, voxels being removed, and then finally we end up with these beautiful morphologies that have been optimized for each environment. And once again, you're seeing the asymmetry in environment C. And so we can see that these robots have very much adapted to their environments. But what's exciting is they've all used the same sculpting adaptation system. So same neural network that has been able to interpret the environmental feedback from each of the different environments to then make intelligent decisions about which voxels to remove to get this wonderfully adapted morphology for the particular environments. So finally, we just went into a little bit more detail to see what was actually happening episode to episode regarding the robot's morphology, and in particular, how it's performing in that environment. So for the 7 transferable genomes, we simulated the development process and recorded the fitness of the robot at each of the different episodes. So what we found was quite interesting. We actually found that for the first few episodes, so till about 8, 9, 10, actually the robot is just changing its stiffness. No voxels are being removed, but as nicely illustrated in in the left-hand side graph, the fitness of the robot does actually increase. But at environment episode 8-ish, that's when voxels start to get removed. And we see a big drop in performance, especially in the more challenging complex environments such as B and C. And so then the robot will start to adjust its stiffness, and actually we get some really successful robots. So this is quite interesting. The reason the development systems are actually able to overcome this drop is because they're only seeing the performance in the final episode. The evolutionary algorithm doesn't actually see the drop. But if we're using like an alternative, like a gradient descent as our adaptation mechanism, then it wouldn't be able to go through the drop, and instead it might just avoid it, and therefore we might not get the same level of success. So in conclusion, we've presented a novel method of evolving optimal sculpting adaptation systems that develop the morphology of a robot based on environmental feedback. Interestingly, for a small percentage, we've observed good transferability between environments, and using a single neural network was able to develop different well-adapted morphologies depending on the environment. So of course, we'd be able to get even better performing adaptation systems if we evolved in 3 different environments rather than just 1. This is something we've been working on and hope to publish soon. And we also anticipate that making the network more complex, perhaps using the CPPN, which is quite common in the world of virtual creatures, would yield more interesting robots. But for now, I will leave you with some little videos of the robots walking, and I welcome questions.
Okay, thank you very much for your very clear talk, Kathryn. I see that we already have a question in the Q&A tool that I'm going to read. So the question is from Federico Pigozzi. He says, thank you very much for your talk. Have you tried changing the initial shape of the robot? If yes, how do the results change?
So this isn't something I have tried, but it's something I've thought about quite a lot. So I think it would be a super interesting area of work, and it's something I really want to research. But for the time being, I just kept the morphology the same. I really wanted to test how much the change in performance was just down to the development and the adaptation of the morphology. And I was a bit worried we wouldn't be able to separate the 2 concepts. So if you're changing the initial robot shape, is actually that the thing that's like increasing the performance, or is it the development? But it's very much something I want to look at in the future. So thank you for your question.
Thank you for the answer. I have another question. Is the kind of generative representation that you're using somehow resolution agnostic? So can you reuse what you evolved for the 6 by 6 by 6 cube initial shape, reused for another shape, a bigger cube, let's say?
So I don't know. I would love to be able to tell you that. At the time I was working on this piece of work, it was taking so long to simulate even the 6 by 6 by 6 cube. I was just using now probably quite a old version of VoxCAD voxels. And so to answer your question and the one just posted in the Q&A, how long did it take to compute 15 episodes? Probably about a minute per robot. So a very long time. So, and then of course, if you then scale up your robot to be a bigger cube, 10 by 10 by 10, that's then increasing your computation time significantly further. However, I know that the Vermont team, so Sam Kriegman, Josh Bongard, etc., have just brought out Voxcraft, which I'm a massive fan of, which means you can run these type of simulations so much quicker. So maybe in the future, I'll be able to investigate further morphologies, bigger morphologies, etc. And if they're listening, that was a plug for the Vermont team and their work.
Okay, thank you. So you already answered the other question from Tin Nguyen about the, let's say, computational weight of each simulation. Well, I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to thank you again, Kathryn Walker,